Welcome back, everyone, to Classical Mythology. This is part one of Module 2, where we will be looking at the issue of creation stories. Perhaps a better word for it would be origin stories. We're not every mythology has the idea of the world actually being created, but many of them are interested in where the current reality came from, and they explain that in various ways. So this basic question, we're faced with: where did the world come from? Again, not every culture is interested in this question, but many are. So in a variety of mythologies, we have variations on stories that attempt to articulate how the world came to be. And I think this is a pretty natural reflection of a deep human need to know where we came from. People want to know their family background, their social background, where did the larger group they belong to come from, but even the world in which they inhabit, how did that come to be? And this search, I think, is part of a means for people to find a place and a sense of order in a world that is often frightening and confusing. So many people want to find meaning in sort of the order of things and the way the world works, even if someone from a more cynical perspective might think there's no meaning to be found. So there's a very basic desire for a sense of structure and coherence in reality around us. And put from a more kind of philosophical perspective, the basic question, why is there something rather than nothing? You can't really get much more fundamental in terms of an existential question. Why do things exist at all as opposed to not existing? So very often when we talk about ancient creation stories, again, there isn't necessarily a creator god involved. This idea of a creator god is very much a kind of Judeo-Christian archetype. So often these stories about origins are called cosmogonies. The cosmos, this Greek word alludes to the generation of the cosmos. The Greek word cosmos itself carries with it the connotation of an ordered reality. So it's really the antithesis of chaos, cosmos. And the goni part of that word has to do with the production or generation of the ordered world. And certainly one of the most famous and well-known of the ancient Greek cosmogonies is found in the Theogony of Hesiod, which is the text we'll be looking at closely today. Much like Homer, Hesiod reflects a long oral tradition that predates the widespread use of writing in Greek. So by the time that authors like Homer and Hesiod were finally written down, they were already part of a often centuries-long tradition that was very well developed. And these works held an enormous cultural significance within the larger Greek context. And when we look at some of these earliest examples of Greek poetry, like Homer and Hesiod, they are usually backward looking. They are referring back to an earlier period of their civilization. So even though they may have been written down towards the beginning of what we now refer to as the classical period, the stories that they recount take place much earlier in what we would term sort of the Bronze Age world, or Mycenaean Greece. And during the second millennium BCE, there was a number of kingdoms that flourished in the ancient Greek world, that is the world around the Aegean. There were a number of great cities like Mycenae, Thebes, Sparta, and this is really the world of the Trojan sagas. So the story of Troy and all the heroes that went to and from Troy take place in this environment. And as we know it now, this world is really the stuff of legend. This is the major product that people like Hesiod and Homer produced. But we do know that there were a number of Eastern Mediterranean societies that thrived in this early period until a sudden collapse, which is known as the Bronze Age collapse, where archaeologically we have evidence of a number of cities in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East suddenly collapsing, empires falling, knowledge of writing is lost, and a kind of dark age resulted. And the cause or the causes of this collapse are largely unknown. There's many speculations. Was it environmental, military, economic? Nothing is conclusive. And all that remains, for instance, of the Mycenaean culture, which is an archaic Greek culture, are remains of palaces and a few clay tablets. On these clay tablets, we find a very archaic form of Greek, so we know there's a cultural and linguistic continuity there, as well as a few mentions of some Hellenic deities. And as far as we can reconstruct, these Mycenaean societies were ruled by tribal chieftains who built large palaces. These palaces were the center of an extended network of exchange, so there were craftsmen, farmers, herders of various sorts. And Hesiod's writing reflects a period in which Greek culture was attempting to recover and emerge from this dark age. His work describes a re-emerging civilization of wealthy landowners and peasant farmers. And this period has come to be known as the Iron Age, between about the 10th and the 8th centuries BCE. As time goes on, the population increases and city-states start to re-emerge. So this is the basic kind of governance structure in much of the ancient world, but more complex forms of government are needed as various social factions compete for power throughout these ancient societies. And very often a powerful member of the elite class emerges and sets himself up as a sole ruler. In ancient Greek, these strong men, if you want to call them that, were known as tyrants. The Greek term tyrannos refers to a kind of absolute ruler. And the people that they ruled developed over time a sense of common civic identity and identified themselves as a people or a demos. And as a result, many ancient Greeks were intensely loyal to their civic identity, and they had a great attachment to their specific city-state. So, for instance, they would have considered themselves Athenian or Spartan or Theban first and Greek second. The notion of Greekness was only kind of secondary unifier in the region. But certainly when Greece was invaded in the 5th century BCE by the Persian Empire, it was very difficult for the Greek city-states to establish any kind of unity. They were already in competition with one another for power and resources, even though they shared a common language, religion, and culture to a large extent. That culture also included a repertoire of myth stories and epic sagas. That was also a shared element. And these stories were told and performed at a variety of civic festivals, athletic competitions, religious rites, agricultural festivals, etc. And we'll see over time, as we look at different examples of classical mythology, that almost always there's some kind of practical or ritual element that we can assume or reconstruct coexisted with the myth as it was understood in antiquity. So for the ancient Greeks, like anyone else who has a highly developed mythology, those stories help shape their sense of identity and how they view the world. So this is not surprising. And in these stories, the various gods and heroes, and we'll be looking at specific examples of these throughout the course, these figures are really front and center in the ancient Greek mythological universe. And when I use that term, because someone asked me about it the other day, I mean the world that the mythology kind of builds for itself, because it is a kind of accumulation of storytelling traditions. They all come together to build a vision of reality, and people who are immersed in that mythology accept that as the way the world works, but we of course view it more from the outside. So one of the big questions that needs to be answered, though, is where did these gods come from? Obviously, if they are so important and influential in the world order, there must be some explanation as to how they came about. So the main source for a Greek cosmogony that we're going to look at in this course is Hesiod's Theogony. There is a translation of it in your textbook starting at page 56. And I will be making reference to that translation at various points over the next several minutes. And so if you have your textbook close by, you might want to pause the video and get a hold of it so you can follow along, or if not, you can always refer back to the specific passages when you read it later. So Hesiod's Theogony is a poem, like many ancient Greek poems, that's placed in what we would call a pastoral setting. So that's it's a kind of specific genre and world in which a lot of ancient Greek poetry, presents it for itself. And this is the kind of countryside, it's the non-urban space, it's the world of these like singing, storytelling shepherds, of whom Hesiod presents himself as being another example of one of these kind of rural bardic figures. Now, very often in ancient Greek poetry, this is completely artificial, that the poet has never spent any time in the countryside. They are more of a kind of urban scholar poet, especially in later periods. But in terms of how Hesiod is received, because not much is really known about him specifically, his kind of image is one of these pastoral storytellers. And like any good pastoral poem, or most any ancient Greek poem, it has to follow a particular structure. And that structure has religious implications. After all, remember, this is a poem about gods and goddesses and deities, all of whom were taken seriously by the ancients. So they weren't just curiosities or the source of good storytelling. Maybe for some people, but I think we have to assume that there is a sacred dimension to how these stories were understood, especially in their original setting. But the poem begins with an invocation of the Muses. So that's another important aspect of ancient poetry, is the poet themselves rarely claims credit for what they are saying. They are always presenting themselves as inspired. They are just a conduit for the poetry, which comes from a divine source, most specifically the Muses. These are the goddesses of art and inspiration. And the poem starts with them praising the kind of current cosmic regime, the gods we might call the Olympians. So these are the major ones that people know about, like Zeus, Hera, Athena, Apollo, Artemis, Poseidon, Aphrodite, etc. Those are the kind of conventional deities that most people recognize when they think about Greek mythology. But what's interesting about Hesiod's poem is what the story he describes is one of regime change, that the rule of the gods is never permanent. Well, in general, it's kind of permanent, but gods can replace other gods as sources of authority. So in order to kind of lay the groundwork for telling this story, Hesiod has to first acknowledge that the current regime is the one that whose authority he recognizes, even though he's going to tell the story of how they came to power. That's essentially what the Theogony deals with. And the title itself, Theos in Greek is the word for God, so Hesiod is specifically interested in where the gods came from, not just the world itself, which is left in open question. All of these deities come to be in a world that already kind of basically exists. He's interested in the emergence of various types of deities. And Hesiod, at the beginning of the poem, receives a kind of commission from the Muses. He says on page 56, they told me to sing of the family of blessed ones who are forever. And there's a lot of emphasis placed on the immortality of the gods in the poem. And in the coming modules, we'll look at the kind of notion of a god or a goddess in classical mythology. And for the most part, they are very human-like. This is one of the major features of Greco-Roman mythology, is the anthropomorphic nature of the gods and goddesses, who behave very much like humans. They have human emotions and human-like relationships. The main difference is they are immortal. That's really what, and they have greater power as a result. So those are the two things that really set the gods apart. But we'll say more about that in a coming lecture. Also, and I think this is important to emphasize, and this you find this also on page 56. The Muses allude to false stories about the gods told by other kind of shepherd poets. They say, shepherds that camp in the wild, disgraces, merest bellies, we know to tell many lies that sound like the truth, but we know to sing reality when we will. So this implies that there's already in Hesiod's kind of environment multiple versions of the stories about where the gods come from. And this is, I think, something we have to grapple with as well, because again, people ask me about this all the time, like what is the correct version of a particular myth story? Well, there isn't usually a correct version. In fact, most major gods in the Greek and Roman pantheon have multiple versions of their important stories, especially their origin stories. And the variation in these stories, I think, points to something important. Why were people advocating for different details? And I think that's something we have to learn to appreciate instead of being kind of frustrated by it. I mean, it would be nice to have a kind of completely, perfectly systematic textbook presentation of a mythological system. And that's, often what you see in kind of popular books and representations of Greek mythology. But on the ground, it's very messy. Like, it's a very tangled network of all kinds of variant traditions whose credibility or not is evaluated in different ways. So the Muses are telling Hesiod, well, there's a lot of false information being spread about the gods, and so he's kind of commissioned to correct that. At the same time, we learn that the Muses, as children of Zeus, who is again the kind of current monarch of the cosmic regime, they also have a function of giving coherence to that regime. They give eloquence to kings. Not only do they inspire poets, but they give words to rulers. So this is a culture, and we can see this already. Ancient Greek culture is one that places an extremely high value on speech and the kind of spoken word. As much as the literature is important, it's very clear when you look at the whole kind of civic life and education traditions of the Greco-Roman world that things like rhetoric and public speaking, along with poetry, were the most highly praised disciplines. And in order for one to navigate and excel and kind of succeed in political life, often one had to have a mastery of language. So ancient Greek education is very much focused on poetry and grammar and proper kind of speech patterns, as opposed to any like more quote unquote like they're not at all really interested in the kind of more scientific disciplines that we emphasize today. I mean, they certainly had mathematics and geometry and that sort of thing, but that's not what children and people who passed through the education traditions were mostly interested in. So the life of the city-state really depends on the articulation of ideas. And one of the ways that ideas are often articulated is through poetry. But returning to Hesiod, though, he is, he does more kind of praise of the Muses, and he's finally ready to embark on a kind of poetic creation of his own. But he becomes interested in this question of establishing sort of who came first in the cosmic order and in the succession of the gods. Which deities were first entered into existence. So on page 58, in the third paragraph, he gets to this question. He says, "First came the chasm, and then broad-breasted earth, secure seat forever of all the immortals who occupy the snowy peaks of Olympus, the misty Tartara in a remote recess of the broad-pathed earth, and Eros, the most handsome of the immortal gods, dissolver of flesh, who overcomes the reason and purpose of the beasts of all gods and all men." So this, for him, is, primary, the first kind of deities that existed are in some ways more abstract. They go on to have more human qualities, but the first thing that exists is a kind of void, and then you have the earth. But also, kind of remarkably, I think Hesiod in particular says that Eros is also one of these original primordial deities. Eros means desire. And Eros is later evolves into the kind of Cupid figure, and in other versions of Greek mythology is a son of Aphrodite, but in this version, desire, specifically sexual desire, is presented as a kind of cosmic driving force. And as we see the story play itself out, in all of Greek mythology, the gods and goddesses are very often driven by their sexual desires. So, in a certain sense, the power of Eros transcends, the powers of some of the later deities. So at this point, we see essentially the basic architecture of the world being put into place. There's the night and the day, there's the heaven and the earth, and then some of these divine figures start mating to bring forth other divine figures. So the earth and the sky get together to bring forth ocean. So that kind of puts another piece of the earthly puzzle into place, as well as a host of other, I guess, primordial deities, like the Titans and the Cyclopses and this group called the Hundred-Handers. So there's an initial kind of proliferation of divine progeny in this sort of first phase. But the father, remember, earth and sky come together, but the father sky, Uranos in Greek, he becomes horrified at his own children. This is described on page 59, and he kind of tries to conceal them and imprison them in the earth. And the Earth Mother comes to resent this, and ultimately kind of fashions this sort of super weapon that one of her children can take up against their father. So there's an element of patricide and father killing deeply embedded in this early stream of Greek mythology. So again, on page 59 of the translation in the textbook, we have one of these children, Kronos, takes up this weapon, and the name Kronos, one interpretation is the cutter. So on page 59, towards the bottom half of the page, it says, so she spoke, but they were all seized by fear, and none of them uttered a word. But the great crooked schemer Kronos took courage, and soon replied to his good mother, Mother, I would undertake this task and accomplish it. I am not afraid of our unspeakable father. After all, he began it by his ugly behavior. So he spoke, and mighty earth was delighted. She set him hidden in ambush, put the sharp-toothed sickle in his hand, and explained the whole stratagem to him. So he ends up lying in wait, and as the father comes home in the nighttime to, have relations with the mother, Kronos ends up castrating his father and casting aside his father's genitals. So, for people who've never heard this story before, it's like very violent and shocking. There's all Greek mythology is filled with murder and incest and assault and abuse of all kinds. It's as much as it's the subject of kind of highbrow art and literature over time, it is in fact very brutal in its essence. But this castration of the sky god leads to the next kind of unique feature of Hesiod's account, and that's the birth of the goddess Aphrodite, and this is at the beginning of page 60. So Hesiod says, as for the genitals, just as he first cut them off with his instrument of adamant, that's this powerful mythological metal, and threw them from the land into the surging sea, even so they were carried on the waves for a long time. About them a white foam grew from the immortal flesh, and in it a girl formed. First she approached holy Cythera, then from there she came to sea-girt Cyprus, and out stepped a modest and beautiful goddess, and the grass began to grow all around beneath her slender feet. Gods and men call her Aphrodite because she was formed in foam. So this is another very important variant version of where the goddess Aphrodite came from. In other stories, she's like daughter of Zeus, or she's further down in the kind of generational chain. But Hesiod places Aphrodite much earlier in the origin story, which again gives her more priority and power than she might have otherwise. And you see like some depictions of this story of like Venus emerging from the sea or from the foam. But since she's the goddess of sexuality and procreation and desire, there's also this violent connection that's made. She's the product of this, vicious castration that happens, and that's how her powers enter the world. So once again, not only is Eros itself a kind of primordial deity, but Aphrodite, who kind of embodies Eros in a further dimension, is also said to be pre-Olympian. So it's no wonder then, the audience can think, and we can think, well, it's no wonder people like Zeus or gods like Zeus go running around chasing sexual gratification all the time, because the powers that inspire that predate his existence. After this episode, we get to the emergence of another kind of generation of deities. In this case, it's the night that brings forth many evils in the world. things like death and misery and resentment and deceit and old age. These are all products of the darkness. In addition, the ocean brings forth a whole host of divine figures, the daughters of ocean and the various nymphs. And we also get a long list of kind of monstrous beings that come to be in this phase of the narrative, the Gorgons, the Chimera, the Sphinx. These are all kind of sinister antagonist figures in the mythological tradition, but they are fit into this narrative framework. We also see, and this is on page 61, a long list of earth, water, and air spirits. And most of these figures are really just names. There's not really a strong storytelling tradition around many of them, but it speaks to this idea that the ancient Greek world was highly populated with divine figures. In fact, Hesiod said, "It is hard for a mortal man to tell the names of them all." So really lurking around every corner and in every possible space was some kind of presence of the divine, that exists in a multiplicity of manifestations. Like later religious traditions talk about the presence of a divine figure in kind of everything that exists, but in the Greco-Roman worldview, the whole world is filled with gods and goddesses of various types and with various functions. And in fact, there's a famous saying by an early Greek philosopher named Heraclitus. He said, "The world is full of gods." So it's not just that the gods exist in some remote mountaintop or some inaccessible space. They are literally everywhere. But this phase of Hesiod's story is really one of kind of multiplication and procreation on a mass scale. Then we get something that's kind of a strange digression in the overall poetic work. For some reason, Hesiod has a special interest in the goddess Hecate. So this digression begins about halfway through page 64, going on to 65. This goddess is mostly associated with magic and witchcraft, and she's not at all mentioned by Homer. And she doesn't play a particularly prominent place in most other attestations of Greek mythological tradition. But Hesiod devotes a significant passage of his poem to this goddess, who in many ways is kind of amorphous, and her jurisdiction overlaps various regions: the sky, the earth, the sea. We're told she protects warriors and athletes and hunters and herders and fishers. As we'll see when we look at individual deities, usually they have a kind of jurisdiction and things they're responsible for, or a kind of social class they protect. Hecate, and sometimes there's overlap and duplication there, but Hecate is kind of very broadly conceived in Hesiod's vision of the world. But some of the imagery seems to point to a Eastern origin in Asia Minor, or even further in Babylonian tradition. The goddess Ereshkigal in ancient Babylonian texts, which far predate Hesiod and the Greek tradition. There's some shared characteristics there, but it's well demonstrated now that Greek tradition, mythological traditions, and Mesopotamian mythological traditions were in a kind of dialogue in antiquity where they influenced each other in some ways. Next, we come to sort of the main purpose of the story. That's where did the Olympians themselves come from? So by this time we have, Kronos, who overthrew his father to become chief deity. That's the kind of second regime. Him, along with the goddess Rhea, produce Demeter, Hera, Hades, Zeus. Again, these are more familiar names. But Kronos, he doesn't want to be overthrown by his children like he overthrew his own father, so he swallows his children. Again, that's a very grotesque kind of mythological motif. But the infant Zeus, however, is kind of spirited away to the remote island of Crete, and in his place, Kronos ingests a stone instead of Zeus. But then, of course, as you can imagine, Zeus comes back, defeats his father, and sets his siblings free, and so this leads to Zeus being established as king of the gods. So again, a new regime is put into place, and this is the one that is still in power up until Hesiod's time, and the one that rules the remainder of the Greek mythological tradition. But this, tradition of the authority of Zeus isn't kind of universally accepted. And we get a indication of this in the story of Prometheus, which is also highlighted in Hesiod's narrative. At the bottom of page 66, it says, Olympian Zeus, who rules on high, was not unwilling, intending that the fame of Heracles, born of Thebes, should be still greater than before upon the wide pastured earth. This is why he did reverence and honor to his eminent son, and irate though he was, ended the anger that he had before, which was because Prometheus pitted his wits against the mighty son of Kronos. For when gods and mortal men were coming to a settlement at Mekone, he had carved up a big ox and served it in such a way as to mislead Zeus. For him he laid out meat and entrails rich with fat in the hide, covering it with the ox's stomach, while for the men he laid out the ox's white bones, which he arranged carefully for a cunning trick by covering them in glistening fat. So again, this is one version of a story in which Prometheus acts as a kind of antagonist to Zeus, an opponent to Zeus's regime. And in other versions of this story, this is all about the origins of sacrifice, that Prometheus tricked the gods into choosing the bad portion of the sacrifice, which allowed the humans to get the meat of the animal, where the gods just got the fat and the bones. Prometheus is also credited with giving human beings the gift of fire, which in general is a kind of symbol for technology. It allows humans to use their intelligence to acquire quasi-divine powers. So this too is a kind of violation of Zeus's divine authority. And there's almost resonances here with the whole Garden of Eden story and forbidden knowledge, etc. And as we see in Hesiod's account, in retaliation for this and for human beings acquiring use of fire, Zeus commissions the creation of women, who are then cast in the poem as the source of all evil for mankind. So there is very much a misogynistic undertone, especially in this passage, which is certainly not surprising given the patriarchal nature of ancient Greek society. But it's connected to the Prometheus narrative, which we'll look at in more depth next time. The last major episode in the poem is what's often referred to as the Titanomachy, the Battle of the Titans, or Clash of the Titans, where Zeus basically engineers a conflict between his regime and the old regime. And the old regime here are represented as the Titans. Remember, these were kind of primordial super beings that came into existence early on in the narrative. And once again, we find parallels with ancient Eastern mythology. There are similar sorts of stories in Hittite and Babylonian texts. The warfare among various factions of gods is not uncommon in these mythological narratives. And what ultimately occurs is the Titans are defeated and imprisoned by Zeus in the underworld. So this is a kind of example of Zeus solidifying his power, and it represents the kind of final defeat of the old gods and the establishment of Zeus's new regime. Now, one of the ways, and we will be talking about how these stories get interpreted over time and various methods that are used, but some people and historians and scholars of mythology have sometimes asked, well, when you have stories told about one group of gods overthrowing another group of gods, is that somehow reflective of a historical dynamic? Do we have one population migrating into the region that comes to control the existing population, and part of that is imposing its religious values? I mean, this is very speculative, of course, but I mean, there could be some kind of vague historical dynamic behind some of these stories of kind of cosmic regime change, because very often what myth stories and religious stories in general are meant to communicate is explanations for what's happening in the real world. Then, of course, at the end we have Zeus mating very prolifically with various other Olympian type figures to produce even more gods that we're familiar with. So Persephone, Apollo, Artemis, Ares, Athena. Many of these we'll be looking at in detail later on. Hermes, Dionysus, and eventually Heracles. And with Heracles, we have this sort of beginning of the age of heroes, the kind of part divine, part human sort of mythological figure. We'll be talking again specifically about them towards the end. So the Hesiod story ends with another kind of period of procreation where Zeus produces in various ways lots of different divine powers that will help him reinforce his cosmic authority. So that brings us to the end of part 1 of module 2. I advise you to read Hesiod's Theogony in its entirety. It's very much worth reading, but remember that Hesiod is only presenting one perspective on the origin of the gods. That perspective was influential, and we have to understand the details of Hesiod's account, but his account certainly isn't the only one, and we'll be looking later at other versions. So it doesn't necessarily mean that Hesiod is wrong or someone else is right. What we want to understand was, why are they telling a different version? What does that say about the society in which those stories have been told? So we'll continue with this theme of origin stories in the next part of Module 2.